Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us with you today. I'm Ben. I'm a current senior at UNC Chapel Hill studying neuroscience, and I'm generally pre-med, so I'll be headed off to medical school in the fall.
And my name is Francisco. I'm also a senior at UNC Chapel Hill studying neuroscience. And just like Ben, I'm pre-med and off to medical school in the fall as well.
And we are very excited to chat with you all today about anxiety and depression. This is particularly important to us because I personally have struggled with anxiety in the past.
And I've struggled with depression for quite a bit now.
Right. And we feel that there are some, some concepts around anxiety and depression, especially there are some misconceptions around anxiety and depression. Now, I know that, us young people, I feel like have a greater understanding of anxiety and depression than maybe previous generations did. And oftentimes folks understand a good amount about anxiety and depression. So we're not going to try to just cover a bunch of stuff that you already know. We're going to see if we can bring up some misconceptions and maybe throw in a little bit of science knowledge in there, some neuroscience, and bring in some content that maybe is not so widely understood. So what are we going to be talking about in particular? We'll talk about anxiety, again, misconceptions, how to tell when you have too much anxiety, and then for depression, the same sort of thing, how to tell a problem in yourself or someone else. So with anxiety, we'll, start with a couple of memes up in the front. These are made by people with anxiety, but of course we should say they don't encompass the full spectrum of what people with anxiety might experience. But we'll start off with a question here. What do you think? Eating right, exercising, and living an overall healthy lifestyle will make anxiety disorders go away. What do you think? To answer this question, you can bring out your phone and go to text and text 37607. That number 37607, you can text healthy to that number. If you do that, it should send you something back and you can text A or B, and that'll let you vote in here. You can also, if you have access to Wi-Fi, you can go to pollev.com/healthy, and this poll question will come up and you can answer on there. So we'll wait a little bit. And for what it's worth, we won't wait here as long as we normally would, just because it's recording and there's nobody who's going to answer anyway. But typically we would wait around maybe 30 seconds to a minute, let all those results come in, and then once they come in, we can reveal. In this case, let's imagine that the majority came in, I don't know, true, let's say. So I'll carry on. So, yeah, eating right, exercising, living an overall healthy lifestyle. These are excellent things to do. Yes, good idea generally, and generally good for mental health. But unfortunately, they aren't going to eliminate an anxiety disorder typically. What that means is that if you are experiencing anxiety, too much stress all the time, and folks have told you, oh, go eat right, exercise, that'll clear things up. If that's not working for you, that's totally understandable. Many people have been in your same boat, and there are options that are more effective for you to help with that extra anxiety. So in this case, we'd say false. I'm going to carry on, and we'll first talk about the neuroscience of anxiety. I want to be very clear, though, at the outset that we'll talk about what's going on in the brain with anxiety, but you should understand that there are lots of different ways of thinking about anxiety. People might have anxiety for all sorts of different reasons. For example, somebody might have anxiety from interpersonal relationships, from social struggles, social stressors, sometimes, people's personal history, maybe things that have happened to folks. Sometimes trauma can lead to anxiety, or really all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it just happens. Sometimes people just have anxiety and not really for any good reason. But for those folks, we'll talk about what's going on in the brain when someone is experiencing anxiety. So first, why do we have anxiety in the first place? Of course, it's normal if you're facing down something that will eat you, or maybe if you're facing down a test or a big, asking someone out or something like that. You get that kind of fight or flight intense reaction. Your juices get flowing, you're ready to go, and you're maybe thinking about all the different options. You're thinking about what might happen. You're thinking about what you're going to need to do to be able to get out of this kind of stressful or intense scenario. But unfortunately for some people, some of the brain regions that are responsible for coordinating this big stress response this big fight or flight, oh my gosh response, like maybe the amygdala, can get overactive. Again, that can happen for all sorts of reasons, personal history, social relationships, or it just happens. But whatever the reason, these brain regions will be going off. They're activating too much, they're popping off all over the place, and you'll get too much stress. Sometimes way too much stress in response to things that would normally be only a little bit stressful, and sometimes a baseline level of stress that's just there with you all the time. Some people will say that they just kind of feel low-key stressed a lot of the day, or maybe just a lot of the time. And why is that happening? Again, we've got some brain regions that are overactive. What is happening whenever we have all of this stress all the time, it can feed back in to this amygdala activation that we're talking about, this brain region that's going off. And also you'll get stress hormones. Cortisol is one of those pictured here on the side. Of course, the specifics don't matter too much, but these stress hormones are not healthy for you. You've got these stress hormones coursing through your body all the time, and it's just not good for you. What's happening whenever we have all of this stress response all the time? A few things. Sometimes and often we have anxiety when unnecessary. There's no real reason to be anxious. You might just have baseline anxiety. Also, sometimes you can have a wrong analysis of emotions in others. You might misunderstand how other people are feeling. You might, for example, believe that other people have negative opinions of you when really they don't. You're just kind of detecting that because these brain regions are going off too much. And then also, again, you'll just have some fear responses where there isn't any good reason to have fear responses, or really, really strong fear responses in response to things that shouldn't cause that big of a reaction. So how to tell if you or somebody else may have an anxiety disorder in particular, right? As distinct from, just experiencing stress on a day-to-day life. So how to tell, but we'll first start with a question for context. How many young adults do you think would qualify for an anxiety disorder? And this isn't necessarily how many are diagnosed, but how many, if you asked everybody, if you surveyed everybody and gave everybody the questions and the diagnostic stuff, how many would qualify? Again, we won't wait here as long as we normally would, but the answer here is around 32%. Around 32%, which is a lot. And what we mean specifically by this is by the time we, reach age 18, around 32% of young people will have at some point in their life experienced something that could qualify for an anxiety disorder. What does that mean? It means you're not alone. It means if you're experiencing a lot of stress, it means many people have faced this kind of thing. And also, frankly, many people have been able to, through help, through therapy, or through whatever other systems of support, have been able to move through their anxiety disorder and end up escaping those feelings. So what are those feelings? Anxiety, you might just have a lot of worry about work, school, etc., the kind of classic, maybe social relationships. The hallmark here, though, is that you can't control it. That's the absolute classic. You feel like this worry is just going, 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 and you can't turn it off. What happens when you can't turn it off? You might have difficulty concentrating. This might cause distress, some problems in your life. Outwardly, you might have difficulty sleeping. You might be irritable, you might be tense, restless, or experience other sorts of things like physical or mental fatigue. Sometimes people just feel exhausted at the end of a day because their brain has just been going for it all day long. And these will persist and, be disruptive in your life. For some experience of anxiety, just to ground it a little bit in real life, this person, for example, says they're feeling exhausted. Whenever they go home, they feel like their head just won't shut up. That's very common. I know I've felt that way certainly before you get home from school, at 2:30, 3, whatever, and you just collapse, you're exhausted. That certainly can happen without an anxiety disorder, absolutely. But often this is the case for folks who are experiencing anxiety. Sometimes you don't know what you're worrying about. Everything just kind of blurs together. Again, that kind of baseline level of a little bit of tension. In terms of treatment of anxiety disorders, we'll go right ahead and chat about this stuff. So one of the absolute big ones is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is very common and can be extremely helpful for people with anxiety disorders. The cognitive behavioral therapist would help you think about the behaviors and thought patterns that are involved in your anxiety and help you change those. Usually they require a relatively fewer number of sessions. You go a few times and get some strategies for how to deal with this sort of thing. It's very accessible sometimes. Talk therapy also is a great option, just sharing how you feel. And then in the short term, if you have a very intense anxiety attack, maybe a panic attack, or some other kind of super intense short-term level of anxiety that won't go down, something like benzodiazepine medications can be helpful, but they're very dangerous for long-term use. You don't want to have benzodiazepines for a long time because they're addictive. But in the long term, SSRIs are excellent for anxiety. They're typically thought of as a depression medication, but they're very, very often used for anxiety too because they're helpful in that way as well. And they are not addictive, so you don't have to worry about that. Here's a question, just to throw this at you again. You cannot get addicted to your long-term anti-anxiety medication. What do you think? We'll just wait a sec. This one, we would actually wait a little bit shorter of a time. This is a question that we just asked about. So the question is here mostly just to reinforce this concept. So we'll wait for a relatively short period of time and then go ahead and reveal that indeed the answer is true. You can't get addicted to your long-term anti-anxiety medication, so it's not a concern when starting SSRIs as a medication for anxiety. Now here's the critical point. It's so important I've put it in orange. Well, text is in white, I suppose. But this is so important we change the colors. Anxiety and depression aren't permanent and they can be treated. I know for many folks with anxiety and with depression, they feel like they will never stop and they feel like you'll just be that way. Maybe people feel like it's part of their personality, that that's just how they are. They're just kind of an anxious person. But if it's disrupting your life, if it's uncomfortable or unpleasant or a pain, you can get help for these sorts of things. You can get some of that cognitive behavioral therapy, have them help you work through some of those thought patterns and behaviors and be good to go. I know for myself, for example, I experienced social anxiety for a very long time. I could never introduce myself to people or really make those kinds of new relationships with anybody. It was a real kind of problem for me, and I went and got some therapy for it. Did just a few sessions, really. Sometimes it takes longer, but for me, just a few sessions. I ended up working with a therapist. They were very helpful. And with a little bit of personal practice, I had to do some work on my part too. I ended up being able to eventually get through this social anxiety. And now I feel like I'm much more able to make relationships, chat with people, introduce myself to folks, that sort of thing. So they can be treated even if you feel like it's just kind of part of who you are.
So now that we've learned a little bit about anxiety, we're going to transition into learning a little bit about depression. And much like with the anxiety lesson, I wanted to start off with a couple memes just to lighten up a little bit, a topic that can be a little bit kind of heavy and dark. So we're going to start off with a quick question, quick poll viewer question. Depression cannot be overcome by mental willpower without support. And just as Ben was saying, whenever he was doing his presentation, we're going to wait a little bit here for responses to come in, and we're going to now pretend that we've had a couple of responses, and I'm going to answer it as if people answered it as false. So, depression is a disorder, much like any other disorder of the body. There is a biological basis to it, and just like you can't will yourself to get better from cancer or from the flu, you can't really will yourself to get better from depression, especially without support. So this right here, you guys don't really need to know about this molecule, but it's the basis of the cause for depression in a lot of senses. It's right here, serotonin. It's a neurotransmitter, a chemical that's used in the brain for the cells of the brain, the neurons, to be able to communicate with each other. And so there's many reasons for the onset of depression. A lot of those have to do with social factors or psychological factors, just the environment that people live in, or events that they've lived through. But what I'm going to describe here is known as like the biological basis. It's just one of many theories. And so here on the left, we've got cell one, right? And that cell produces serotonin, and then normally it's able to get over to cell two, and the system works as normal, and we get those feelings of joy, of happiness, of, it just works normally. In depression, however, cell one still produces that serotonin, but instead of getting over to cell two, it's taken back up super quickly, and it's not able to get to cell two. And so that leads to feelings of despair, of sadness, of depression. And so this slide right here, you can just see, you guys can just see that there is there's a clear marked difference between the brain of someone who is not living with depression and someone who is living with depression. Just to transition into another question, which of these always affects people with depression? And so with this question, we probably give a little bit more time, maybe, instead of 30 seconds to a minute, maybe 45 seconds to a minute and 15, something, just to get the students to think about these symptoms a little bit. And now I'm gonna explain it as if I had gotten responses. So, this question's a little bit tricky. All of these are seen in depression. They're common with depression, but none of these is needed for the diagnosis of clinical depression. We all think that depression is, just sadness or feelings of worthlessness, and that's what needs to be, present in order to be to have depression, but that's not true at all. So we're gonna now move into something that I think is a little bit more important than the biological basis of depression. It's how to tell whether you or someone else might have depression. And we're going to start off with the internal feelings that are common with depression, and of course, we've got what people think of the hallmark of depression, that is the depressed mood for most of the day, many days in a row, for extended periods of time. But also, not only that, but we also have low interest in activities that we once found enjoyable. I know for myself, whenever I first had my first major episode of depression, I lost interest in activities that I love to do. I loved playing soccer, I loved being outdoors, and just doing anything that had to do with the outdoors. And then I didn't want to do that anymore. All I wanted to do was lock myself up in my room and curl up into a ball and sleep. You can also feel slowed down throughout the day. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you can also sometimes feel restless. We also have feelings of worthlessness and being guilty that you're not good enough, that you were, at one point at the top of your game, and you now feel like you're not at that place anymore, and so you feel guilty that you're not that good anymore, or just, there's some thoughts that I had about myself. They don't describe everything, but just stuff like that. Also with depression, you've got recurrent thoughts of death, and that's not just wanting to commit suicide or wanting to escape, but it can also be, just thinking that the world would be better if you were dead, not actively planning your death, but just kind of like thinking, oh, well, if I get hit by a bus, then maybe it's not so bad. And another thing, especially with young people, is this feeling irritable. Oftentimes it's because, just you're overwhelmed by emotions. And so the only way that you really know how to express it is through to express that frustration is to be irritable, be, lash out and stuff. So now we're going to move on to some outward signs that are sometimes easier to notice in not only yourself, but in the people around you. Changes in sleeping patterns, that may be, sleeping more, sleeping less. Along with that, you've got a decrease in energy, feeling tired no matter how much you sleep or how much you rest. I know that, like I described before, all I wanted to do was, curl up in a ball and sleep. And that's because I felt just so drained, so fatigued for a lot of the day. Like I mentioned earlier, like on the opposite end of the spectrum, feeling restless, having trouble sitting still, wanting to do a million things at once, just to kind of like distract yourself from the fact that you may be experiencing some of these other not so great symptoms of depression. Along with that, we've got changes in eating patterns, an increase in appetite, a decrease in appetite, and to go along with that, an increase in weight or a decrease in weight without actively trying to put on weight or to lose weight. And just as we did it with anxiety, just to bring the picture, to make a complete picture, bring it all together, we wanted to include some experiences of people who are living with of depression. So this first person, they felt like they would never be the same. They were guilty that they weren't, what they used to be before. They had no motivation to do anything. They had no interest in doing anything than just, having to struggle through their everyday life. The second person, like I said, they lost interest in what they once found joyful. Used to, do all these things that used to entertain them and excite them, and just aren't interested in it anymore. Their time slows down. Every day feels the same, like it's dragging on, and again, you have that feeling of guilt for not being able to get your priorities straight, for lack of better words, like this person describes. This third person has your stereotypical presentation of depression, the sadness, wanting to escape. All you wanting to do is, cry, and having no desire to do anything. And just to reiterate, depression is not just sadness, especially in people like our age who are young. Oftentimes it's anger, frustration, irritability, lashing out, all of these things. So just don't think just because you don't have sadness or melancholy or any of these feelings that you don't have depression. Yeah. So now we're going to move on to some treatments of depression. And just to reiterate of how depression works, cell 1 produces serotonin. It's unable to get to cell 2 because it's taken back up by cell 1 too quickly. And so you get those feelings of sadness, those feelings of, depressed mood and stuff. SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are a type of antidepressant that a lot of people take in order to try to remedy this problem. So the way that works, cell 1 produces that serotonin, and it's able to cross and get to the receptors on cell 2 like it normally would in a person who isn't living with depression. And it does that because it blocks cell 1 from reuptaking, taking back that serotonin as quickly as it normally would. And so you've got a lot more of that of the serotonin chemical that's able to get to cell 2. And just another poll everywhere question. Do we think that medication is the only way to manage depression? Since this is just a true or false, we probably wouldn't wait nearly as long to have responses in, maybe 20 to 30 seconds, just something quick. And so, yeah, medication, contrary to popular belief, it's not the only way to manage depression. There's many ways to manage depression. I know for myself, I've lived with depression all these years, and I've never taken a medication. And that's not because I don't believe in it or because I don't think that they work, but because my therapist and the mental health professionals that I sought out planned, saw me, knew me, got to know me, and were able to come up with a plan that best suited me. And that happened to just be different types of therapy, psychodynamic therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy that Ben talked about earlier, all these kinds of talk therapies. And so one last thing, we wanted to make an easy way for you guys to access resources if you guys thought that you might need them, even if you don't need them right now. Everyone take out your phone, scan this QR code really quickly. And what you'll find here is area-specific resources to your area. We've highlighted one specific resource that we think that everyone should take a look at, and that's not the only thing on there. We've got a whole document of therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, other counselors, other resources in your area that we think are worth looking at, especially if you you feel like you're in a niche that may not be, you think that may not be able to be served. But I can guarantee you that we have found these resources, and the resources out there exist for you guys. So yeah, thank you. Do you have any questions?